The Mikhail Lermontov was a multi-million-dollar luxury liner. 12 decks high and longer than a city block, she was the pride of the Soviet cruise fleet. One windy Sunday in February 1986, the Lermontov cruised out of New Zealand's Marlborough Sounds. 738 people were expecting a sightseeing trip down the South Island's stunning west coast. Instead, they sailed into the worst of all possible nightmares. By nightfall, crew members were fighting for the lives of every single passenger on board.
And a Russian came running into me and he said, "Val, move quickly," and threw me a blanket. "Go now."
We're in a Mayday situation.
And John was screaming out, "Pa, are we going to drown? Are we going to drown?" And I said, "No, John, don't be stupid."
The trapdoors came down, and then straight away I was, where's Nan, where's Nan?
So I was terrified, and I just started screaming.
Frantic passengers were herded into lifeboats, fearing for their lives. Their rescue is a miracle. The facts behind the sinking have remained a mystery. Two careers founded that summer's day. New Zealand pilot Don Jamieson gave the orders that ran the ship aground in this dangerous passage, and the tragedy that followed destroyed the Soviet captain's future.
He was a harbor master, Port of Picton. He was the person with local knowledge. He should have experience. I trusted him.
They came to me on the Monday and said, "Look, the ship sailed over a reef that's too shallow, and the bad news from New Zealand's point of view, there was a New Zealand pilot on board, experienced pilot. He should have known what he was doing, and I'm afraid, Minister, we sunk the ship."
On board that night, all seemed lost, but crew on coastal ships, local boat owners and fishermen made heroic efforts to rescue hundreds of passengers and crew. Most of the holidaymakers were elderly and frail. Frozen by cold wind and lashed by rain, the survivors struggled across a series of lifeboats to safety. There's never been a full inquiry into the sinking of the Mikhail Lermontov. Because of this, the only man who knows why she ran aground has escaped public scrutiny. And the Russian crew have never told their story of that awful night, until now. The once gleaming cruise ship lies silent on the sea floor. Locked inside her bulkheads is the body of a 33-year-old man who had no chance to escape. Engineer Pavel Zagliadimov had been with the ship for 2 years, but his son Andrea and his widow Svetlana were never able to bury the husband she supported through his training.
Pavel was a very meticulous man, and he wouldn't leave his post during an emergency. When the accident happened, he went down to his post, the engine room. He was down there, and the water was coming in, and they closed the watertight doors while he was in the engine room.
The dramatic sinking of the Mikhail Lermontov echoed round the world. New Zealand had recently taken centre stage in the Cold War. The new Labour government's anti-nuclear policy had outraged traditional allies, the United States. In international politics, New Zealand was now very vulnerable. The ship's master, Vladimir Vorobyov, was a graduate of the distinguished Leningrad Higher Marine School. After 30 years, he'd risen to become captain of the flag-bearer of the Soviet cruise fleet. But he finished a ruined man. After the sinking, Vorobyov was demoted to a desk job. He now commands a small freighter in Africa. The Lermontov was 15 years old. She had just had a $29 million refit and been strengthened for ice. 12 stories high and nearly 2 football fields long, she boasted an entertainment lounge, 5 bars, an all-weather swimming pool, a cinema, a disco, restaurants and shops.
A cruise on the Mikhail Lermontov will create memories that will last forever. Memories of romantic nights under the stars.
Although Captain Vorobyev was not her regular master, he knew the ship very well and had captained her before. 2 of the most flamboyant crew members were cruise director Peter Warren and singer Val Corvell. Both very experienced on cruise liners, they say the Lermontov's special charms made her extremely popular.
It's just one of those ships when everything came together. It doesn't happen very often, but everything came together. And I think no matter who you speak to, everybody will agree the same thing. It was a family.
For 9 years, Val Corvell called the Lermontov home. Both her heart and her world were on board.
Well, it was the nicest ship that I've worked on, and I loved all the Russians and all the staff. I just loved them.
Passengers boarded this ship of dreams for many reasons. Joan Dillon was recovering from her husband's recent death. The ship's elegance amazed her.
The ship was a lovely ship. It looked beautiful. It was beautifully fitted out. The cabin was lovely. The lounges were all beautiful. And one particular thing that we saw was this beautiful, almost like a, I don't know, a solarium or something, where they had all these beautiful birds.
Here, with the relaxing sound of birds chirping in the background, you can meet with your friends and be served refreshments.
Kylie Krellin left her boyfriend on the wharf in Sydney to keep her mother company on holiday.
I could remember standing on the deck waving goodbye with a small tear dropping out of my eye saying, "Mum, I don't want to go on this cruise. Look, there's no one young."
There were some who simply adored Russian culture. Nolene Roger was on her 3rd cruise.
There was always a lovely entertainment. The Russians did most beautiful dancing at night. I went to Russian classes again this time, but only a couple, and you learn to say spasiba, which is Russian for thank you, and the cruise faces would light up when you said that, and they would say spazhelsta, you're welcome.
The passengers' feeling for the ship was nothing compared to that of helmsman Anatoly Burin.
After a period of time on the ship, you have the feeling she's your friend, your brother. That's the kind of feeling you get when you sail.
And there was much more than affection involved. Everything Jean Anderson owned was in her cabin.
The ship was my home. You live on there. It's not like you're a passenger on there for 2 weeks.
10 days into this luxury trip, orders from New Zealand pilot Don Jamieson led to a tragedy from which many would never fully recover. In a night none would forget, more than 700 people would band together to save each other. Cruising on the Mikhail Lermontov was an adventure more exotic than just sparkling waters. Passengers were served a cocktail of traditional Russia, spiced with Soviet communism, topped off with secret police.
This is a good service, there's a Russian style on board, Russian service, Russian food. We try to show for the passengers Russian style.
I mean, this was one wonderful selling point as far as the ships were concerned, because everybody knew about Russia, knew about the KGB, and here's an opportunity to actually get a taste, you know, a little taste of this communism. Before I joined the company, You know, you think to yourself, we're working with the Russians and it's the KGB and what's it going to be like? And then you're so surprised when you get on that it didn't interfere with anything at all, because they were only there to make sure that the crew and the officers stayed within the limitations of communism.
The journey to disaster started on a fine day in New Zealand's capital city, Wellington. During the Lermontovs' last major stopover, pilot Don Jameson boarded the ship. At midnight, she steamed out of the harbour for the Marlborough Sounds. For 16 years, Jameson was Marlborough's only pilot, guiding hundreds of ships down the long fjord to the port at Picton. This time, a decision he has never explained in public proved the biggest mistake of an otherwise quiet life.
Captain Jameson is a very upright man. He's honest, straightforward, great family man, very thorough in his profession, a good seafaring man.
Jameson loves the Marlborough Sounds. He lives there still. His spare time is spent boating and fishing in deep waters around the maze of islands and inlets. He has always been passionate about promoting his home to the world. Nestled quietly at the head of Queen Charlotte's Sound, the tiny town of Picton was the Lermontovs' last stop before steaming out into the open sea. Ray and Lorna Lane took their grandsons John and Stephen on the cruise as a special treat.
Picton, we arrived there about 6 o'clock in the morning, breakfast at 6:30, departed about 7:30 on a coach to Blenheim, which was very pretty. But there we had morning tea, biscuits, scones, cream cakes, which the two boys
enjoyed.
Made a guts of themselves. Got back to Picton, had our lunch about 1:30.
After midday, the Lermontov crew were hosting a traditional reception for the harbour board. The nature of their hospitality later became a very controversial point.
I went down with the harbour master at the time, Captain Don Jameson, and we met the captain, some of the officers, and exchanged pleasantries, and then he asked us if we'd like to stay for lunch. I can't remember what we ate, but they did shout us a couple of glasses of wine, and I think I left the vessel about 2:30.
Jameson accepted 3 drinks at the reception, but drank no alcohol at lunch. In fact, he was said to be joining the cruise with his wife. After piloting the vessel, the rest of the trip to Australia was his holiday.
The Captain Jameson ordered to prepare for him and his wife as a good cabin. When the vessel arrived in Picton, he arrived on board without wife. I don't know why.
Shortly after 3 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon, the Lermontov left port for the very last time. The captain and the pilot talked about their route. Vorobyov then placed his faith and the navigation of the vessel in Jameson's hands.
This is the usual practice on board a Russian vessel. We discussed our plan, but we did not know the exactly route of the vessel, because we planned ordinary passage, not a cruising.
Vorobyov had agreed that the New Zealander would treat passengers to some sightseeing on the route through the Sounds. He didn't know that passengers already had premonitions about the trip.
One of the ladies we were travelling with, she had a dream the night before we arrived at Picton that the ship had sailed into an aircraft-like hangar and sunk. And when we arrived in Picton and we all hopped off the boat, and Pat says, "That's the hangar." And it was just, we all went, "Oh, wow, is that the hangar?" She said, "That's the hangar in my dream." And we all thought, "Oh, that's a bit hairy." But one of the conversations with Pat's dream, of course, was, what would you take if we sunk? And so we're all having a good old giggle. Oh, we've got to take your sunglasses in case the sun comes. We need a hat, better take some sunscreen as well. And we better take some bourbon, or we better grab the smokes as well, and maybe a blanket in case it gets cold.
This strange omen was echoed by a series of incidents that unsettled passengers and crew. Just moments after casting off, the Lermontov sailed unusually close to shore.
It seemed to back out of the wharf at Picton, and it went round and went back. The back part of it seemed to hit a sandbank like the shore. Now, not for long, just a couple of minutes, and then the engines reversed and it took off and it was okay.
When the ship was leaving Picton, I looked out and saw that for some reason the shore was close to its stern. It was so close to the shore. I'd never seen a ship that close.
The Mikhail Lermontov continued to hug the coastline as the pilot began showing off the splendor of the sounds.
We were passing a bay, and pilot Jameson turned into a guide and began talking through the loudspeakers about what we were seeing and describing the historical monuments and beauty of the area.
One of the first historic sites was a wrecked settler's ship. While taking the huge liner in for a closer look, Jameson slipped on the wet deck and fell, hitting his head, while the ship continued to power closer to shore. On the bridge was New Zealand assistant pilot Gary Neal.
He ordered full astern on both engines, and the ship did eventually pull up very close to the shoreline on the western side of Shakespeare Bay.
It was a moment that the vessel approached too close, was my opinion. Yeah. But we use bow thruster and engine full astern and maneuvering around.
The indication from the officer on the bow at the time was that we got to within 30 metres of the shoreline.
The ship seemed to have a funny turn, and I was standing there next to some Picton people, and they said, "Goodness, we've never seen a ship do that before."
On that occasion, the bow thruster had been switched off and the ship did not respond as anticipated. There is a well-beaten route out of the Sounds. Cruise ships leaving Picton normally make for the widest channel toward open waters. But on this day, Jameson directed the helmsman into a smaller channel behind Allport's Island. In clearing the island and turning away from the shore, the Lermontov had to make a hard right turn. And for the third time in less than an hour, crew watched the shore looming larger and larger.
Well, we were up on the deck, and I have to say that at one stage it almost felt like you could put your hand out and touch the land. We just seemed to be so close.
An hour after leaving Picton, there was a crew change, and the next shift arrived on the bridge. Captain Vorobyov discussed the sightseeing plan with the pilot and the new officers. Half an hour later, Vorobyov went below to change his rain-soaked uniform, leaving Chief Officer Stepanishev in command. Buren was at the helm, steering to orders given by Jameson. This single decision to leave the bridge, no matter how reasonable, destroyed the captain's career.
According to the Russian Fleet Standing Order, the chief officer has equal right and equal responsibility with the master. I have a right not to be on the bridge because it was a chief officer duty at that time with the full responsibility.
With 9 kilometers between the ship and the open sea, Jameson pushed her up to full cruising speed. The Lermontov should be clear of the Sound in less than an hour. At 10 to 5, The Mikhail Lermontov was steaming towards the Tasman Sea at 15 knots, steering in and out of bays. The safest route for a large ship out of the Sounds is to the seaward side of Motuara Island. Once again, Don Jameson drove his new charge between the island and the coast. Ahead of him, at the northern tip of Cape Jackson, a small lighthouse stands battered and windswept to mark hidden rocks. The Cape was the home of the Baker family. David Baker has a vivid memory of the gleaming white Lermontov steaming past their bay.
Magnificent sight. We hadn't seen very many or any ships of that size come through that area. Seen some smaller ones, so that in itself was special to have it that much closer.
In his cabin, the captain ignored the erratic course as the planned sightseeing continued.
My cabin, there was a repeater of gyro compass. I can check the course. The course was changed every 10-15 minutes.
At 5:15, passengers' only thoughts of survival were about lasting till dinner. Some were warming up for vodka tasting in the Bolshoi Lounge. And for the Lanes and their grandsons, their busy day was winding down.
They announced that we were going to have T-bone steak for dinner that night, New Zealand T-bone steak, which we were all looking forward to. So we all cleaned up. Stephen was tired. He fell asleep on the floor, and John was colouring in.
At this point, the ship was on course to steam clear of the lighthouse and into open sea. Between light and shore is the notorious Cape Jackson Passage, a sunken rock shelf studded with pinnacles and raked by swirling currents. It was a channel that small boats travelled with great care. For the Lermontov, it was unthinkable. But at 5:21, with the ship off Kemp Point, Jameson gave an order to change course. It was the first in a series of turns, driving the dream cruise toward disaster. 9 minutes later, as the Cape Jackson Passage slid into view, Jameson issued another order to turn left. The most luxurious liner in the Russian fleet was now steaming straight at the lighthouse, marking Jackson Passage.
The pilot gave the command 10 degrees left, so we swung left slowly for a long time. Then he gave the command hold a straight course, so we followed that course for a little while.
4 minutes later, with Jackson Lighthouse 700 metres ahead and approaching quickly, Jameson gave the final ruinous command. His course between lighthouse and shore confused the passengers and alarmed those on the bridge.
Then he gave the next command, left 10 degrees. We were passing 0 degrees, so I had to report the course. The next command was, hold this course. On our right was a lighthouse, and there were breakers. And to the left there was an area of still water. Not a very extensive area, but quite enough for the ship to travel through. It looked like a regular passage. As we turned, I saw Stepanishev go towards the porthole and talk to the pilot. At the same time, I looked at the pilot and saw that he was standing in an unnatural way. He was leaning against the bulkhead between the two windows. He had his head on the wall and his right hand against a porthole.
I looked out the porthole and I saw this Cape Jackson light. And I thought, that's strange, because beyond the light was nothing but sea, ocean. And if you have a light like that, it should have a shore in the background. So I thought, this is very strange.
Despite the chief officer's concerns, Jameson held his course. Still ploughing ahead at 15 knots, the Lermontov took 3 more minutes to slam into shallow rocks.
You can hear the metal, the sound of metal being torn, and some blows of the vessel like that. But not very strong, but you can feel that it struck something.
At best, the Lermontov's hull might have cleared the hidden reef by just 4 meters. The ice-breaking bow grazed past the rocky outcrop, but the wider hull section was ripped apart. Those huge gashes can still be seen, 25 meters long and half a meter wide. Water began pouring in at 63 tons per second, enough to fill a suburban house in under 5 seconds.
We were heading to the Bolshoi Lounge and I had to go to the toilet. So while I was in there, we hit the rock. At the time, I thought, oh my God, did I do that?
We ran up onto the deck and I looked at the wake of the ship, which is normally like a green path, and it was full of sand, muddy and dark.
Incredibly, on the bridge, Jameson issued more orders to turn left. Apparently, in a daze, he was turning the Lermontov back onto the shore. The stunned helmsman was finally saved by Captain Vorobyov.
We were thrown a little to the right. Then the pilot gave the command to the left. That means the left wheel. We began to turn left and there was a rocky shore ahead, and even if we had been able to swing without hitting the shore, we would have turned back onto the same rocks. At this point, the captain came running. Of course, he was furious and shouted, "Why are we in this place?"
When I came on the bridge, the Captain Jameson tried to give the command to helmsman 10 degrees port. I said stop and start to hand over the command of the vessel myself.
When I got to the bridge, Staff Captain Melnik, Captain Vorobyov, helmsman Burin, and the pilot were there. The pilot was standing a little bit to the right. He was holding his head in his hands. He held his head like this for a long, long time.
Captain Vorobyov took control of his badly damaged ship, heading for deeper water. Clear of the reef, the shocked master found his ship was mortally wounded. 6 minutes after the collision, Vorobyov sounded the general alarm. All the watertight doors slammed shut, the pool was emptied, and the main pumps started a race they could never win.
I check on the emergency control plan. Where is the seawater? Then, when I receive information from my staff that the seawater penetrated more than 3 waterproof section, I understood that the vessel is in dangerous situation.
The Mikhail Lermontov had already claimed her first victim. Pavel Zagliadimov, a refrigeration engineer, was working deep in the hull when the steel wall near him ripped open. The compartment flooded in seconds and the bulkhead was locked. The Lermontov could float with holes in 2 of her watertight compartments, but in just 7 minutes, 4 were filled. The pumps were working as hard as possible, but they could never match the torrent. In the bar, Kylie Krellin noticed something strange.
I just said, oh, hey, Mum, look, these drinks are all leaning. She said, oh, don't be silly. And I said, but I'm not silly, they are leaning. Oh, you've had too much to drink, she said. I said, no, I haven't, Mum, have a look. Oh, they are leaning. She said, oh, don't worry about it, it'll be fine, which we didn't. Continued to have our Russian wine tasting, and Mum said, would you like a dance? I said, yes, I'd love a dance. So Eleanor and Mum and Pat and myself, we all got up and had a dance, and the band played on, so to speak.
the band was playing and some of entertainers was giving explanations, and passengers were tasting wines. And the cruise director came on the stage and said, look, ladies and gentlemen, apparently we have hit the rocks, but it is not much we can do about. What do you prefer while we are going to the coastline, that the show goes on or that it stops? And the people started to shout, oh, the show must go on. So.
Under low cloud, in freezing rain and choppy seas, Captain Vorobyov began making decisions that could save or lose over 700 lives. Just moments after crashing headlong into the sea floor, the Lermontov started the perilous list that her crew knew would take her to the bottom.
Но в силу конструктивной особенности судна, то есть вода продолжала...
The water began to come in through the lift wells and through the ventilators. It began to cut off the technical equipment, which affected the balance of the vessel and the safety of navigation.
И на безопасность мореплавания. То есть начало выходить из строя электрооборудование, распреть щиты, которые могли повлиять на движение.
Shortly before 6, 14 minutes after the impact, Captain Vorobyov asked pilot Jameson to direct them to a safe beach. Running the stricken liner onto shore might save his ship as well as her passengers. The pilot radioed for guidance. At home, the Bakers heard Jameson's plea for advice.
Repeat your ETA port call, you are making and breaking.
Mrs. Baker suggested a small cove as the best option along the rocky coast.
This is Cape Jackson Radio, Cape Jackson Radio.
It lay in the crook of a large bay, still more than 5 kilometres away.
When they reported that water was coming into the lower compartments, the captain immediately ordered that a plan of all the compartments and tanks should be spread out to calculate where the holes might be and how long the ship might stay afloat.
His terrible calculations proved very accurate. Vorobyov has 4 hours to beach the sluggish ship, or to save the passengers before she sinks.
It was a plan to proceed as close as possible on the sand beach and disembark passenger.
The ship was difficult to steer. We had to maneuver using the engines, first the left and then the right. That's how we travelled to the bay.
Mikhail Lermontov, please call again. Mikhail Lermontov, Picton Harbour Radio, message received as follows. We have struck a rock off Cape Jackson and are heading to Port Gore with the intention of beaching the vessel. We're in a Mayday situation. Please call Wellington Radio. Mikhail Lermontov, please confirm.
1.5 hours away, an LPG tanker was listening to the dreadful call. The Tarahiko's captain, John Reedman, hauled anchor and set sail to help.
On the VHF 16, I heard the message. Mayday, this is Mikhail Lermontov. I actually thought it was a Russian fishing vessel. And just after we got underway at full speed, I checked the reference book with the ship's name in it and found it was actually a passenger ship, a Russian passenger ship of some size. So that got our interest up, and we were speeding along at maximum speed to the area.
Also nearby was the inter-island ferry Arahura, carrying over 600 passengers of her own. Captain John Brew says the Lermontov's radio call had an electric effect.
We were proceeding from Wellington to Picton, and we were steaming down Tory Channel. No problems, the ship was on time. And from the radio, we heard ZLW, Wellington Radio, talking to another ship that had a problem. It's the word Mayday that caused the silence to fall over the wheelhouse here.
But the emergency call had not been the official distress signal of 3 Mayday calls. With the Lermontov sailing to shore, rescue coordinators called the Arahura and the Tarahiko to stand down. Incredibly, hundreds of elderly people were heading for a remote beach in rain and approaching darkness, while the largest ships in the area were advised to stay away.
They told us that the Mikhail Lermontov was going to handle the situation by themselves and we were no longer required. So we had a couple of hours in hand and I decided we'd carry on and have a look at this situation. We started to prepare the lifeboats, we started to break out the blankets, told the cook to stand by to make some extra food if needed. Everybody was just getting ready for some excitement.
In the confusion, Wellington Radio took a message from Jameson stating, "The master says he does not require assistance." The captain and Jameson still dispute who was responsible for cancelling the Mayday.
I asked him to help me to send the Mayday, and he carried out it. I did not cancel.
I never spoke to the Russian captain at all, so in theory, my presence there was breaking all the rules of the sea. To speak to the pilot was not the done thing. It's actually the Mayday situation should come from the master. And the pilot is only there to advise the master, so what I was actually doing was wrong. I never got permission from the Russian master at all.
Sitting high on the point at Cape Jackson, the Bakers were listening to the same radio confusion that John Reedman wisely ignored.
Cape Jackson Radio.
The Bakers made a decision that probably saved hundreds of lives. They rode over the ridge to have a look for themselves.
Came to the top of the hill and saw a ship just out off the western side of the Cape, about 2 nautical miles in, heading into Port Gore, listing to the starboard and showing at least a couple of metres of anti-foul on the stern. So to us it was a ship not looking particularly happy. And as we watched it go further up into Port Gore and appear to be listing more, we realised that the situation was serious. Yeah, and it grew over a period of an hour, that from what was an assessing situation to, hell, we may need to do something about this, what are we going to do?
Finally, there were people who understood the urgency. The Bakers hit the radio. They called only those they knew could handle such a dangerous situation. The enormity of the task galvanised the locals into action.
Just got into the house to sit down for evening meal and the Mayday call came out. It was Mrs. Baker actually that rung us and said we should go to Port Gore to see if we could help with whatever might eventuate.
Well, we knew the ship had a big list and was taking water, so we imagined somewhere along the line they were going to beach it or it was going to be evacuated and all the people were taken off it. So we were prepared for that, and we knew it was going to be in darkness.
As far as the sea conditions, there was no great problem. I mean, it was only a little chop there for a small vessel. But just the logistics of what do you do with, as we thought then, 1,000 people. There were 2 fishing boats in there, which we found out later, and that was all. Pretty mind-blowing, pretty scary.
On board, cruise director Peter Warren raced upstairs to see if he could help.
I went straight to the bridge, and Captain said to me, right, your responsibility is to be here to make the announcements, such as don't panic and, you know, if necessary, seat and brace yourself, because we were trying to make into the shallow waters.
The voice came over and said, ladies and gentlemen, just to tell you there's nothing to be alarmed about. And that made us a bit worried, what we were not supposed to be alarmed about.
Nobody seemed to be telling us anything, but the next thing, this elderly lady came through and she had her head all bandaged and there was blood seeping through the bandage.
The coordination centre for the emergency was 60 kilometres across Cook Strait, but the Wellington officials were having major problems. Their radios could not reach the flotilla of launches and fishing boats racing towards the Lermontov.
The radio traffic situation was particularly bad, partly just because the geography of the area meant that we couldn't rely on communications between Wellington and Port Gore, but also because the sheer volume of traffic meant that there was a great deal of confusion. The currency of the information we got varied. Sometimes we knew it was second or third hand and had passed through various people before it reached us. Other times we got very good information.
Normally, the short trip to shore would have taken the luxury liner just half an hour. As locals sped towards her, the Lermontov was shipping water at an enormous rate, crawling, virtually unsteerable, and closer every minute to sinking. Passengers finally understood the danger.
I said, Mum, come back. I said, Mum, there's no one in the bar. So maybe I should have just helped myself, but there was no one anywhere. And I said, Mum, I'll just go down to our cabin and I'll grab us the bourbon and the smokes that we talked about. You want the sunnies while I'm there? And our life jackets while I'm there. That might be important, Mum. So off I toddle, and I get to the stairwell and I look down the stairwell and there was just water swirling everywhere. And I just went, oh no, Mum had just said there's nothing to panic about until it's time to panic. And I raced back to Mum. I said, Mum, psst, it's time to panic.
I looked down the stairs and I could see the water starting to come up. You know, you look down like this and I could see it starting to come up, right? God, I was scared to death.
The race against time slipped away with every litre pouring into the hull. At 7:15, Captain Vorobyov's final hope was extinguished, along with the ship's power.
I tried to approach, to reach this sand beach. But when I increased speed, increasing penetration of the seawater in the engine room.
The water had already reached the main switchboard, and we couldn't get the main engine started again. The ship's momentum couldn't carry her to the beach, so we gave the command to abandon the engines.
With her engines drowned, the Lermontov was uncontrollable, and now beyond all hope of reaching shore.
I understood that there is no chance to save the vessel. It was clear for me that it's necessary to save passenger and crew as soon as possible.
Within sight of the shore, Vorobyov gave the most heart-wrenching order: abandon ship. But the Lermontov's first lifeboat quickly returned. The supposedly sandy beach was rocky, steep, and too dangerous to step onto.
There were about 60 people altogether. As we went towards the shore in the boat, the sailors were checking the depth of the water with poles. I was worried because the water was 2 meters deep, and I'm only 1 meter or something.
Putting people ashore was too risky. The desperate captain now ordered crew to load up the lifeboats and transfer passengers to the rescue boats. As night fell, so did the rain. Just before 8 o'clock, the Tarahiko arrived to find a calamity unfolding. They spoke to pilot Jameson on the radio.
Mikhail Lermontov, Tarahiko. Mikhail Lermontov, the sooner you get here, the better anyway. It's so far it's getting dark here. We're right into the top corner of...
Keep a check on the distance, yeah. We couldn't actually see it because it was a dark night. It was a heavy rain. The wind was about 25 knots. And visually we saw it about 3 to 4 miles away. She was listing about 20 degrees to starboard. Lifeboats were being launched.
Okay, in light of the railway ferry coming, do you wish us to take passengers still?
Well, I don't like the look of the situation here. If you can get something, there's just a few less to worry about, in my opinion, even if we get to her after she gets here.
And the stupid part about it at that stage was, still didn't think there was anything really, really wrong. And I bought some, on that cruise, I bought some really nice crystal glasses. And I remember putting them on the bunk and wrapping them all up in the blankets so that if anything happened, they wouldn't get broken.
And I ran back in the cabin, and a Russian came running into me and he said, "Val, move quickly," and threw me a blanket. "Go now."
The crew people
just ripping people out of the cabins and rushing you up and pushing you, and didn't have a chance to get any of our toys. And
She said, come on, quick, quick, get your life jackets. They were up on top of the cabinet. And I sort of about my wife's bag. No, you haven't got time. Come on, the water's coming in. So we had to leave her bag and all the belongings there. And John was screaming out, Pa, are we going to drown? Are we going to drown? And I said, no, John, don't be stupid.
Somebody spoke to me and I stopped to talk to them. And of course then I went on, and just as I started to move forward, the watertight doors closed. So Ray, Stephen and John were on the other side, and of course I was terrified. And I just started screaming.
the trapdoors came down, and then straight away I was, you know, where's Nan, where's Nan?
Then one of the crew came along, stewardess, and she grabbed me. She was very, very good. And she literally pulled me up the stairs and took me right up to the top deck.
When we finally got to the top and we met back up with Nana, we felt a bit more safe that we were all back together again.
Well, all I could say was, no, you're not going to drown, boys. Don't worry, don't worry. But of course, being at that age, naturally that's what they thought. But at the same time, I thought we might too.
At 9 p.m, the Arahura was still half an hour away.
Mikhail Lermontov to Arahura, go ahead. With regards to evacuating these people, do we need to use their boats or ours? Well, they get people into the boats now. I think probably better to keep them alongside and transfer them straight to you when you arrive, over.
Part of Captain Vorobyev's plan was to lower the still empty lifeboats into the sea and for the people to board them through a small door lower down in the Lermontov's hull. But getting the passengers down several decks to that hatch was a nightmare job.
The boats had been put down into the water, so we had to get them down. So we had to get them along corridors and down flights of stairs, and it was quite dark. I think one of the things I remember, you sort of laugh about it now, but it wasn't funny at the time, but the minute we said, right, to all these people, you've got to do this, it seemed like it was a cue for all the dear old ladies to go to the toilet. They all wanted to go to the toilet.
We didn't know why we were being taken back inside the ship. And of course, when you're on a ship that's starting to list very badly, the last thing you want to do is go inside the ship. But by this time, the ship had listed more, and we just were all hoping that it didn't give one final movement and we'd be gone.
We went down to H-deck, and the lifeboat was level with the deck then, and the Russians were standing beside the lifeboat, and it was very difficult getting into the lifeboat, and I just said to them, I can't jump, and they just stretched out their strong seaman's arms and said, come on us, come on us.
I was just about to come out the cabin and the ship seemed to take this tremendous lurch, and then it went completely black. All the lighting, everything went, all the lights went out, and I was in this cabin in this pitch blackness. And you lose all sense of direction of where you are. And I was tugging and tugging on what I thought was my cabin door to get out, and it wouldn't open. And that's when I thought, I'm going to drown in here, I really am.
I went to my cabin to get the safe and all the documents I have to carry with me. I pulled out the drawer of my desk, and inside was a packet of personal photos. I was going to put them in my bag, but I realised that if I took them, it meant that I wouldn't be coming back. So I put my photos back in the desk.
At 9:35, the Arahura finally arrived. With over 600 of her own passengers, she took as many survivors as she could handle.
We're navigating on radar entirely, and we crept into Port Gore. We saw the lights of the gas carrier, so we had his position, There was no light at all from the Mikhail Lermontov, but we had him as a target on our radar. And we crept down to about a mile off him and stopped.
Well, when we put our lights on in there, it pierced the blackness, but only marginally so. It's amazing how the darkness eats a light unless there's something to reflect. You know, you sort of go back to all those physics lessons at school, you know. But the reflection was the main thing, and it was the ship itself that was lighting the scene because it was reflecting light.
Inside the Lermontov, the crew were frantically working under dim lights powered from their own emergency generator. At 10:20, the Navy ship Taupo arrived. Her commander was shocked by the scene in Port Gore.
The anchors were just touching the water as we approached it, and I think it's something that when you've been at sea for a long time, to see another ship dying like that was absolutely stunning. I think everyone felt absolutely stunned.
We initially got close to Lermontov. We lowered our dinghy off the stern into the water. Very nervously tried to hang a 25 horsepower outboard over the stern without dropping it, which was pretty hard work when you're scared, but we did. Put our fuel tank and everything in, and then just basically went into the scene, which was very chaotic. Hura was coming up and actually manoeuvring into position and getting her lifeboats down, ready to do the same thing as Terahiko.
Terahiko, all ships coming into Gore Bay, all ships coming into Gore Bay. The Mikhail Lermontov is adrift. I advise you not to anchor.
4 ships and over a dozen small boats now shadowed the stricken Lermontov as she drifted helplessly out into deeper water. Into this confusion, the Terahiko's first mate carefully steered one of his lifeboats underneath the 12-storied giant.
We could see that passengers was crowding at the gunport door, and we took on about a dozen, 15 survivors. Because there was a Russian motorboat approaching us, we didn't want to be trapped alongside this towering ship, which was slowly but surely and visibly listing further towards us.
During these frightening maneuvers, a passenger fell unnoticed into the churning sea. The Lermontov was now listing too far to load more lifeboats through the gunport door. The crew tossed rope ladders down her steeply tilting side. The calm evacuation was turning into a desperate race.
We got to the end of a long corridor. I felt like chariots of fire running. You just couldn't run fast enough. So we were running as fast as we could on a listing ship, and there was just a purser or someone down the far end, and they looked like they were miles away at the end of a tunnel going, come on.
We had to climb over the edge of the ship and go down the rope ladder. The crew were pushing you and, you know, in their own language, I suppose, saying hurry up. Because of the list of the ship by this time, the rope ladder ran out. So you just had to jump.
It wasn't easy for a young fella. Well, it wasn't easy for the old people either, but I remember saying to Pa, let's jump, let's just swim, you know, because I knew I could swim.
There was a great big plate glass door and it was banging open and shutting. So I put my back on the door and held the door closed with my back and helped all the passengers down the stairs. Because by the time I'd helped them, it was going.
The captain ordered me to go around the ship once more and check that everyone was off. It was difficult to move. I felt as though I could hear the ship breathing, and I realized how difficult it was for her.
You just were going not along the corridor, but if you went along the corridor, one of your feet was on the floor and the other on the wall, because it was already nearly 45 degrees, so you walked like that.
I saw an elderly man with a bottle of whiskey in the bar. He refused to leave. I tried to pull him out myself, but he wouldn't budge. So I went to get someone else, and we managed to get him down the rope ladder and into the boat.
Most of the passengers were all already evacuated. We just found one old lady in a library and an elderly couple, people over 80, just sitting in their cabin. Because the old gentleman, perhaps he had many whiskeys, perhaps because he was afraid, so we just invited them outside.
According to the captain's calculations, the ship would stay afloat for 4 hours. And so at the end he was shouting, hurry up, and swearing. We knew the ship would go down at any moment.
Dave, I understand there's a number of passengers still on board the Lermontov. They're on the starboard side, somewhere around the gunport door. There's no lifeboats left for them. I wonder whether you'd mind going and picking them up.
Yeah, we took the last 48 passengers from the ship, plus 2 of the Russian crew that were there helping them get off the ship, down the ladder and onto the boat. The passengers were absolutely speechless. They were in a very stunned state.
It was a very frightening experience getting from our lifeboat into their lifeboat because it was choppy and we were winched up the side, and then it was very difficult to get from the lifeboat onto the slippery deck.
There was one elderly lady who was badly gashed leg, and I remember the steward and I went to help her down because she couldn't walk, and we put our hands underneath to lift her up, to carry her and support her. And she said, "Oh, careful boy," she said, "I've got no panties on."
We sighted someone in the water. We saw a small light, which we think was a life jacket light. The crew identified they had an elderly man in the water who they dragged on board. I could see that there was a man who's blue, whitish blue at best. He viewed himself as incredibly lucky. He explained to us that his light on his life jacket wasn't working, and he had the presence of mind to sit in the water and dismantle it and rebuild it and get it going.
The Russian crew and the rescuers had performed a miracle, but now they could do no more.
We saw the captain, dressed in his uniform and cap, appear at the stern. He got into a motorboat, and when we saw him move away, we did too. The ship began to sink, on a steep angle, the right side in the water. At first she was sinking slowly, then she just vanished.
The noise from the ship was unbelievable. You know, the air hissing out of ventilators and crashing of sounded like glass, but obviously bulkheads blowing with the pressure. It was very, very noisy explosions, great gushes of air, hissing and squealing and whistling, and then all of a sudden the bubble stopped coming up and everything just went dead silent.
We had crew who were, say, 2 years in the Navy to crew who'd been in the Navy 20 years, and no one had ever seen a ship such as that sink. And I think when you spend your life professionally at sea, to see another ship die in that fashion was just amazing, absolutely amazing.
So we went back to this cargo ship and they let us come on it. Let us go on it. And that's when all the Russians were there and they were crying. And I was. They said, we won't be seeing each other anymore, Val.
We realized that the Lermontov had sunk, and at 11 o'clock, the New Zealand sailors put out a cross of light over the water where our ship had been. This is when the tears came, and I wept and wept. It was a storm of tears, and the sailors cried, and everybody cried.
Some of the passengers were injured, and the crew's prized possessions lay on the sea floor. They were all exhausted and distressed. And they wanted an answer. How did this unthinkable accident happen? In the turmoil before the sinking, the crew combed the ship for stragglers. They thought and hoped everyone had been saved. And sailing to Wellington, the Russian crew began a count of the survivors.
I give a command to check the crew according to the crew list. After 20 minutes, I receive information that one crew member is missing.
Divers searched the ship and the shoreline, but Pavel Zaglyadyumov's body never resurfaced. At 5 o'clock on Monday morning, the dazed passengers stepped back onto dry land in Wellington. For the first time in nearly 12 hours, they felt physically safe. The injured were hospitalized. Some had broken bones and hypothermia. Many were in shock. But in this extraordinary rescue, all 440 passengers with an average age of 70 years were saved. In the confusion of their arrival, pilot Don Jameson's union colleagues spirited their man away from the authorities.
When they arrived in Wellington, he was under guard by 2 Russian officers, and they weren't letting him out of their sight. The union at the time, General Secretary John McLeod, managed to arrange for Don to go to the toilet. And when he went to the toilet, they managed to whisk him away and get him out of the clutches of the Russians.
He left the ship quietly and unnoticed. That's all I'm going to say.
Captain Brew lent Don Jamieson his jersey to hide the gold braid. We proceeded to leave the ship. I consider that one of our first major achievements, getting past all the print media, electronic media, without even being recognised, and into our office. And we even got past the police too.
The union and lawyers kept Jamieson out of the public eye. Even after he returned to Picton, he made no public comment. Meanwhile, distraught passengers were trying to recover their composure. After the trauma they had suffered, the holidaymakers spent an unsettled night in Wellington hotels. The next day they went home, their exotic trip cancelled permanently. Leaving the captain and 4 officers, the rest of the crew flew back to Russia to face an uncertain future.
Our company met us. They addressed us while we were still on the plane and said to us, "Dear people of the Lermontov." And there was almost like a howl of tears through the plane. I looked all around, and all of us were weeping.
In Leningrad, a new widow carried on with her life. For 3 cruel days, Svetlana had no idea her husband had been killed.
We heard it on the news, but it wasn't the official bulletin. It was the Voice of America. We had no idea it would have been Pavel, because the bulletin said that a sailor had died in the sinking, not a mechanic. On the Monday, I got an official note to say it was the Mikhail Lermontov, but it wasn't until Wednesday that I learned it was my husband. They said they were searching for him, but in all probability, he was dead.
The New Zealand government quickly learned how the Russian superpower's best liner wound up on the sea floor.
My officials had a very good idea as to why the ship had sunk, even on Sunday, and they most certainly, I think, came to me on the Monday and said, look, the ship sailed over a reef that's too shallow, and the bad news from New Zealand's point of view, there was a New Zealand pilot on board, experienced pilot. He should have known what he was doing, and I'm afraid, Minister, we sunk the ship.
The government immediately launched a preliminary inquiry and appointed Captain Steve Ponsford, a Ministry of Transport investigator, to run it. It took 1 week to interview the Russian officers, the rescue boat captains, and the New Zealand pilot Don Jameson. The inquiry has been criticised for several reasons. One of the criticisms was that Steve Ponsford was a personal friend of Jameson's.
Before the inquiry, I had known Captain Jameson for many years as a friend and as a seafaring colleague. I didn't find any difficulty whatsoever in conducting a preliminary inquiry in which Captain Jameson was one of the main witnesses.
The public expected the inquiry to recommend a full investigation or further legal action to repair the loss of the $100 million ship. A full and formal inquiry is the norm following shipping accidents on the New Zealand coast, but Captain Ponsford stunned the marine fraternity when he advised against it.
As far as I was concerned, I had established the facts leading up to the sinking of the Mikhail Lermontov, and in my opinion, a formal investigation in a court would have achieved no more than what was achieved during the preliminary inquiry. And I recommended accordingly, and the Minister accepted my recommendation.
Oh, I thought the findings were absolutely accurate. In fact, I've never seen anything to make me change my mind.
So the Minister delivered the report to bemused journalists. The government felt it had all the answers and was not interested in the questions.
According to the report, the cause of the casualty was a decision by Captain Jameson to navigate the Mikhail Lermontov through the narrow passage between Cape Jackson and the Cape Jackson Light, a passage which in the event was not deep enough for a vessel of the Mikhail Lermontov's draft.
The announcement that Jameson would not face a full inquiry stunned survivors. The lawyer for Australian passengers believes a full inquiry was necessary.
A couple of the purposes of a preliminary inquiry is to identify whether, at the early stage of collecting the facts together, there remain questions unanswered. And at the end of the preliminary inquiry, there were many questions unanswered, not the least of which is why what happened.
The high-level government decision to drop the whole matter means much of the evidence was never scrutinised. Ponsford had found all the evidence credible, yet there were dramatic conflicts between the parties over events on the bridge as the ship headed for Cape Jackson.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's most important that you cooperate with these people. Thank you very much.
Pilot Don Jameson told the preliminary inquiry, "I ordered port 10 degrees and started to go through the passage. The order was not questioned."
The Russian officers gave evidence that they did ask the pilot why he was doing this. They did challenge him to that extent, and he told them that it was okay, he'd done it before.
As we turned, I saw Stepanishev come over and talk to the pilot. He asked the pilot, "Why are we turning left?" And the pilot, Jameson, explained that he wanted to tell the passengers about this particular tragic place where several ships had perished.
My officer were placed in difficult situation. When my officer, is my opinion, when my officer understood that is some dangerous situation, they have no time and place to abort.
It would take a very brave man to take the command away from the pilot, because you can imagine when we went through all the details of what happened, imagine what we would have done if, in fact, what the pilot was doing was correct and Gusev or Stepanichev had said hard a starboard and then gone on to the reef in trying to make the turn. Imagine what we would have said as lawyers. What? You took the ship away from the experienced harbour master? The pilot? A man who knows the place intimately, who's been piloting since 1970? What absolute fools you must have been.
The safe rescue of 738 people was a minor miracle. But the official inquiry sank almost as quickly as the ship. The few pieces of evidence about Don Jamieson's mindset are confusing. He did talk about events on the bridge during the brief Ponsford inquiry, but only a full investigation would really explain his actions. It was never held, and Jamieson has never broken his vow of silence. One of the most controversial issues has always been alcohol. Was Jamieson drunk when he directed the ship through the passage? 4.5 hours earlier, the pilot had accepted drinks at a reception with a Russian crew, then went to lunch with them.
The pilot, Captain Jamieson, admitted that before lunch he had consumed 1 beer and 2 vodkas at a presentation before the ship sailed.
Captain Jamieson gave me some very honest answers without any hesitation, and I repeat, in my opinion, the use of alcohol by Captain Jamieson or any of the other officers on the vessel had no relevance whatsoever as to the reason for the sinking of the Mikhail Lermontov.
That's really quite extraordinary that anybody in his position of responsibility could have consumed alcohol before he took a ship and 700 passengers out of quite a difficult port exit. I mean, there'd be no question of a captain of a 747 having a beer and 2 vodkas before he took 350 people off on a 747, and here was a pilot taking 700 people off on a ship having consumed alcohol, and we really don't know how much alcohol there was. Was it a big beer? Was it a big vodka? We don't know, but it may have been quite a lot of alcohol. There shouldn't have been any at all.
Jamieson told the inquiry he took a shortcut on the spur of the moment. Approximately 3/4 of a mile southeast of Cape Jackson, he said, I made a sudden decision to go through the passage.
When I went and visited him, he was hidden away in the top story of his house. He'd been hounded by the news media, as would be expected. And I asked him then, why did it happen? And his comment that really sticks in my mind is his comment that he felt as though he was driving off the road in the middle of the night, just taking that, drifting off into the gravel.
In self-defence, Jamieson claimed he was just worn out. In hindsight, he said, the only explanation I can offer for the action I took is that I was suffering from mental and physical exhaustion, and that I was overstressed as a result of working long hours for an excessive period of time. To support this claim, Jamieson's diary for the last months of the previous year showed an average 70 hours a week at work.
There were times when at midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, his wife was so concerned that she went down to the office of the Marlborough Harbour Board and insisted that he come home for a rest.
Well, he was acting general manager at the time, and he always was harbour master and pilot. Now, the piloting in Picton was never an onerous job, because his only piloting 6 to 10 a year at the most.
Obviously, Captain Jamieson was under a lot of stress, suffering from fatigue, and obviously that can affect one's judgment.
I don't think Captain Jamieson straightforward never said to the board that he was overworked. He may have said that in his statement, and remember, he had to have some excuse for the decision that he made.
If he wasn't generally overworked, but he was nonetheless spending 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, doing something of make work in an obsessive sort of nature in the office, then the Harbour Board should have known about that as well.
The New Zealand inquiry did not check Jamieson's claim of overwork, but Australian lawyers did. Questions put by Marlborough Harbour Board's counsel in the Australian case suggest that Jamieson was working more reasonable hours in the month and a half before the accident and had 11 days break in January and February. He was not drunk, but he worked long hours in the week before the grounding. Psychiatrists say fatigue can adversely affect decision-making. Is this enough to explain his rash decision? To the inquiry, he said, it was certainly not a planned course, but a decision made on the spur of the moment and quite out of keeping with my normal behaviour. Jameson first directed the Lermontov toward Cape Jackson 16 minutes before hitting the rocks. He turned again 7 minutes before reaching Jackson Passage, and gave his third and final command 700 metres before the lighthouse. He told the inquiry that when he decided to take the passage, he thought it was deep enough. I am aware that the passage is used by coastal vessels, and I was of the understanding the depth of 35 to 40 feet existed in the passage close to Cape Jackson.
When Captain Jameson said it was a spur-of-the-moment decision, if you can picture a vessel heading north to go round the lighthouse, as one would normally do, and before reaching the lighthouse, looking to port, seeing the open waters of that passage, it's not illogical to turn a vessel through into that passage in order to, put it crudely, take a shortcut.
There were several mariners among the people at RCC on the night, and I recall they talked about the fact that it should have been possible to get the ship through the gap. As long as the tide was right and the ship was in the right position, it was possible.
There is room there for a 100-foot wide ship. I think the ship was, if I remember, it was 100 feet wide. There is more than 100 feet between the pinnacles, but with the tide running and a ship of that size, my thoughts are that you get the bow through, but by the time you got the stern through, the tide would swing you one way or the other and catch you on one of them.
The Lermontov needed over 8 metres of water. At best, during high tide, she could have cleared the reef by less than 4. The hazards are clearly marked on marine charts. The blue shading is shallow water. The dotted line shows a depth less than 10 metres at low tide, and the crosses show there are hidden rocks. The lawyer for the Russian government believes that Jameson simply wanted to be the first to prove the passage was passable.
He also, I think, had this real need to show his prowess as a seaman, and that's why he liked to be taking the ship close into shore, and he obviously got a thrill from broadcasting over the public address system to the passengers, and basically conning the ship in areas where no one else would take it.
In the case of Mikhail Lermontov, I can only speculate that perhaps this was a case of attempting to break new professional ground.
Oh, I've never had any doubt. I think the reason is that he had a rush of blood to the head, that he was showing off that day.
My own theory is that he was trying to, if you like, be a Frobisher, find the Northwest Passage and make a name for himself.
I would have no doubt if he had pulled it off, it would become a piece of local folklore very quickly. And we'd probably be reading about the QE2 doing the same and not getting away with it instead.
A plush, multi-million-dollar ship was destroyed. 1 man had died. Yet no action was taken in New Zealand against the pilot who admitted responsibility for directing the ship onto rocks. Russian officials launched their own government-backed inquiry, and a court case in Australia won compensation for the passengers. But Jameson did not appear at any of these hearings. The Russian inquiry found that he was primarily at fault, but the Soviet justice system could not punish him, so it turned on the crew.
Captain Jameson was far from Russia. I've been in Russia. It's necessary to find culpable. Yeah. The culpable was found. The Chief Officer Stepanishev.
The navigator, Chief Officer Sergei Stepanishev, was sent to prison for 4 years and fined $70,000. He could have avoided the disaster, they said, by overruling the pilot.
The sentence meted out to the navigator is, of course, totally absurd. It's an instance of totalitarian justice being meted out at a man who had no right, ability, purpose or responsibility for steering that ship anywhere near Port Jackson. He was in fact, he'd been stood down in favour of Captain Jamieson. So having done what the New Zealand law required of him, he gets in the cooler when he gets back to Russia.
Captain Vorobyov was punished as well. He was confined on shore for several years, demoted to a poorly paid desk job.
It was difficult to live with a salary. My family is wife without work, is two sons, is a student and schoolboy. It was difficult economically.
But the Baltic Shipping Company was still $100 million out of pocket, and Russia wanted some of her money back. The Soviet government's salvage experts recovered valuables and emptied the Lermontov's fuel tanks. Then the Russians hired Australian lawyers to sue the Marlborough Harbour Board for their loss.
The Marlborough Harbour Board obviously had insurers behind them. It's no good getting someone who can take a judgment, but then when you come to enforce the judgment, there's no money there to meet it. So what we were looking for, in effect, was a deep pockets insurer.
Although he was charged jointly with the Harbour Board, Jamieson refused to appear before the Australian courts.
We served a default judgment on him because he didn't appear to answer the charges. Now, we could have, if you like, executed that judgment against him, bankrupted him, quite easily. But we didn't, because there was no real point in it. It was more of a tactical thing. And as far as I know, that default judgment still remains, I'm not saying in force, but it still remains there.
In an out-of-court settlement, the Marlborough Harbour Board later paid $4.6 million to the Lermontov's owners. The claim was over $100 million, the payment just a fraction of the Russians' loss. And when the distressed Australian passengers got home, they in turn sued the Soviet government. 141 passengers, led by Joan Dillon, eventually won a total of more than $3 million for their pain and suffering.
Well, naturally, it was very nice, but I honestly did not go into the case primarily for getting the money out of them. I just wanted to mainly find out what actually happened.
Despite the risk to so many lives and one death, New Zealand authorities never laid charges against Jamieson.
If I had a charter party on this boat tomorrow and I went out there and I hit a rock at Cape Jackson and sunk this boat, I'd be crucified. I'd probably lose my ticket. I'd be splattered all over the newspapers. I'd be splattered all over the television. If I'd drowned somebody off this boat.
I find it extraordinary that there were no charges as a result of this incident. We had a Russian seaman killed, 700 people put in mortal danger, and a ship worth at least US $25 million lost. So there was massive property loss, a death, and yet no charges at all came from it.
Legally, the situation concerning Captain Jamieson's actions was very, very complex. You had a number of different statutes involved. There were time limits, there were difficulties of proof, there were limitations over what penalties could be awarded. It was a nightmare legally.
The local police quickly dismissed the idea of a manslaughter charge. The connection between Jamieson's commands and the missing engineer was not strong enough to mount a case. That left a lesser charge under the Harbours Act.
Manslaughter was not an option because we had no body. There was no relationship between the act or omission that was possibly committed by Captain Jamieson and the possible death of the Russian seaman. The only prosecution option was a breach of the Harbours Act that was endangering ship or the safety of the passengers on the ship. And the penalty for a breach of that section was a fine of $1,000, yes, or 2 years imprisonment or both.
Although the police had a case, no charges were laid. The penalty was just too small compared to the cost of flying the Russian witnesses back to New Zealand.
If I was presented with the same facts today, I would make the same decision today. That is, that I would not prosecute Captain Jamieson.
Although Don Jamieson surrendered his pilot's licence for the Marlborough Sounds, he kept his jobs as acting general manager and as harbour master in Picton. The Marlborough Harbour Board was dissolved 5 years after the sinking. Jamieson is now master of a small inter-island freighter. The hulk of the Mikhail Lermontov lies on her side, rusting where she sank 30 metres below the surface. Salvage was considered far too difficult. Scuba divers had plundered most things that could be carried, and 3 divers have perished in her maze of stairways and murky corridors. Every year, the Lermontov's crew and families make a pilgrimage to Pavel's grave in Leningrad. Among them is a young man who never got to know his father.
I was 5 years old when he died. Well, not quite 5, still 4. I remember he used to take me to his ship and show me around, but apart from that, I just remember isolated moments, like how he took me to town and some of the things we did together.
The burial site, the grave, is really symbolic because his body wasn't brought back. They couldn't reach the compartment in which he perished with the ship. It's a symbolic grave, but we buried a uniform of his that he hadn't taken with him on the voyage.
Singer Val Cavell lost her voice with the Lermontov. The shock of the sinking was so great, the once flamboyant performer has become a recluse.
I can't explain how I feel. It's just, nothing's happening. It's just empty. I've never sang since I left the ship. I mean, I used to be singing in the house all the time. I don't sing anymore.
13 years after the sinking, Kylie Crellin and Joan Dillon sailed bravely back into Port Gore.
It took a while for you to realise you nearly lost your life and how precious those little things are to you that you might have lost on the cruise, or I'm also was my life, you know. I'm 26 years old. I nearly lost my life over there.
Vladimir Vorobyov captained a crew of 338 on the Lermontov. Now he commands the Zambezi round the west coast of Africa with a crew of 7.
I've received my job as a master again, but now I'm 61 already. I lost time for my career.
Vorobyov. I think about him all the time. Wonder what he's doing and the heartache he must have. Because he must have it, mustn't he?
In the years since the sinking, Captain Don Jamieson has never broken his silence. Despite the inquiries and the court cases round the world, passengers still feel cheated.
Until such times as I am able to get an explanation of him, I don't think I'll ever be content with the fact that it was just one of those things that happened. And I'm hoping that one day we might get an opportunity to hear from him. And I would think I would probably be quite happy to just hear him say, "I'm very sorry that I did this to you people."